So these are the instructions for the Barnet Communicator Mask. So you may be making it from pre-cuts from the group, in which case you can skip to the instructions for sewing. If not, you're going to need a pattern and links for a PDF version you can download and print, or instructions for drawing out your own are going to be with this video. But either way, you'll need an A4 piece of paper. And on top of that, you'll need 2 pieces of material of different kinds, obvious pins, a hand sewing needle, scissors, sellotape, a ruler and a pen, and then a piece of plastic 13 centimetres by 7.5 centimetres and some clear vinyl from Amazon and other websites. It's about the same thickness as the plastic in a pencil case or a wash bag, perhaps slightly thinner, but it's also quite manoeuvrable. So certainly you need something ideally thicker than just the plastic on food packaging for documents, envelopes, that kind of thing. And you'll also need 2 pieces of thin elastic 14 centimetres long. So moving on to the material, you'll need 2 different types. The first are thin cotton or polycotton, and the second material needs to be a slightly thicker cotton type. This is curtain material stroke blind material. It's got a bit more substance to it, and that helps give the mask structure, but isn't so thick that you can't then sew through the folds. The most important thing is to make sure that you use a plain material on the outside of the mask so that around the mouth there's no pattern to distract from people trying to lip read or look at the mouth. So that will need to be the outside. The lining can essentially be whatever you like as long as it's thick enough. It's helpful obviously to have a lighter piece of material that you can put your markings on. So in this case I'll actually make the markings on this side so that at the end this will be the side that you see on the inside of the mask. So here's my marked up piece of material. I've actually put in a sewing line all the way around. These are the points at C where you'll be asked to stop sewing, and I've also put the X marks on the ends lined up from the pattern. An easy way of doing the markings can be to literally make a hole at each corner and then use your pen to make a mark in the corners and then join them up with a ruler, and in the middle the same really. You'll need a hole at each corner of each rectangle, and then you join them up with the ruler to give yourself the pattern in the middle. The short end at C, and I'm going to sew all the way around to the other C here, and I'm going to reverse stitch at each end to secure it. Reverse stitch there, secure it, and then I'm going to repeat that along the other side to finish that stage. So now we're going to cut out this mouthpiece of the mask. We begin by cutting around the inside rectangle, and the easiest way to get going on this is to actually fold the mask in half, and then you can just take your scissors and nick through all the layers just to start the cut. Then make sure that you've gone through both of the layers, and I tend to cut into the first corner, turn it and cut along the inner line to the corner. You don't need to worry in this part about being too accurate on the corners because those are going to be cut into the outside rectangle in a minute. That's it, and now we simply cut into the angle of the outside rectangle. Just trying to get right into the corner quite neatly because that will help with a neat mask piece at the end. I'm now going to just show you how to press back the folds of the mouthpiece, and literally just use an iron to run along each side, pressing it down on the line that you drew on the pattern all the way around. Okay, so now I'm going to sew the flaps back with just tacking with a hand needle. Just go through the lining material here. Leave the front material completely clear with the knot on the inside. You can start in the corner, so quite close, as close as you can to the top of the flap. because then when you sew the mouthpiece it will hopefully stay clear of your other sewing. And you just run a long tacking stitch all the way along the top. I've used yellow here for contrast, which will make it easier to pull out later because I can see it, and I'm taking it into the corner there, and then also on the same line to get it up to the next piece, so it kind of lines up like that. And again, that will help when you're sewing the mouthpiece later to stop the tacking getting caught in your final sewing. Hopefully you can see that around the corner, and I'm just going to finish now all the rest of the way around. So just coming around to the last corner, I'm just going to secure it by sewing it a couple of times with big stitches through the lining layer, and I'm going to leave it by being pulled through again so that the ends will end up on the right sides of the material, and you can manage to cut them and pull them out later on. And then I'm going to repeat the same on the black side, so I'm going to fold them back and iron them, and here I try and line up the two pieces of material edges just so that you've got a better chance later on of having a nice kind of tidy mouthpiece without lots of the lining showing. It doesn't always work because it's quite tricky lining up various layers as well as the plastic, but if you start by trying to keep it neat, it helps later on. When you've done both sides, you'll end up with something that looks like this. The most important thing is just to check that you haven't sewn the layers together anywhere. The next stage is to put the elastics in the ends, and I've cut a very thin piece of sellotape, probably about 1/2 centimetre, which I attach right on the end of the elastic. And then I'm going to peel back the short side of the material where the X's are and put that inside between the two layers of material up against where the X is, with the edge of the elastic running along the edge of the material, and just use the sellotape to hold that in place so the elastic will sit at a right angle to the edge, and that means when you sew across it will catch it here. And then I put the other piece of sellotape on the other end of the same side of the elastic, and that tucks down inside the end of the mask at the other X, and again in the same position. And then I secure them with a pin, and I'm going to sew between the two C's to hold them in place. So I'm going to do that to the other side, and then we'll sew. So I'm going to start sewing a couple of stitches back from C, so I'm over sewing a little bit of what I've already done just to secure the stitches. Then we pivot, and we're going to sew over the elastic, then reverse, just to make sure they stay in place when people actually stretch them out. Do the same over the next piece. Sew to C, and then just do a couple of stitches over the other line that you've already sewn to secure it. After sewing round, we're going to trim the edges of the mask so that you end up with a nice clean finish. So I'm going to cut about 1/2 centimetre outside the stitching, but I'm going to leave the short ends where the elastics are untrimmed. Then I'm going to be able to turn the mask the other way around, which you do by folding everything through the central mouthpiece. This is where you'll be able to check if your loops have come out correctly, not twisted, which is okay with that one. Turn the rest of it the right way around and get to the other loop. Then I use a pencil to push out all the edges, just an ordinary pencil. And you can get into the angles, run it along the inside of the seam, push out all the corners, and get quite a nice sharp point along the long edges of the octagon and down to the other short end, across, and we're nearly round. There we go. And then I'm just going to press that to give a nice sharp finish. So I've now pressed the mask so the edges are nice and sharp, and the next stage is to put the plastic window in. So I'm going to turn the mask over so there's more of a contrast for you to see. It will be difficult to see the plastic, so just bear with me. It can be useful to find the centre of the plastic and just make a little dot with a felt tip pen or something, just to help you with placing it centrally, really. So it's going to effectively sit like that, but within the layers. So let's pop it in now. This is a tricky stage. Plastic is very slippery, and you're also dealing with 2 different layers of material, so it takes a while to get it in the right place. So just be patient with that, really. And then the trick is to get a pin in to hold it, which I'm going to pop down here. And then having done that, I'm going to just check again that the plastic hasn't travelled and put another pin in. There's quite a big overlap on the short sides here, just gives you plenty to work with. You don't need loads and loads of pins, but use as many as you feel you need to use. And thin pins are also very useful here because it's quite tricky to get through the layers. And then just doing your best to line up the edges neatly. There's almost inevitably going to be some of the lining layer showing in between, but do what you can to make that neat. And we're going to sew around the edges about 1/2 centimetre from the black edge in this case. I'm going to use orange thread to show what I'm doing as clearly as I can, but obviously you would use a thread which will not show up against the mouthpiece outside, which is in this case going to be black. So I've just put the needle in top left corner, just find that the easiest for me, and I'm going to use the line on my foot to just sew along the edge of the mouthpiece. Take your time, quite tricky. As you get to the end, the foot can actually push the material back quite a lot, so just watch that and lift the foot to free it. And swivel. So that's sewn all the way around. I'm just going to trim that, and I'm going to pull out the tacking threads. Before I do that, I'm just going to check that the plastic is properly sewn all the way around, and then I'm going to use just my unpicker here to pull out tacking threads around the outside. Come out quite simply because you've placed them quite carefully in the first place. So I'm going to do the other side, and then we're going to start folding. So I've removed the tacking from the other side, and this is how we now look. And this is where you have to decide on the inside and the outside of the mask. In this case, this is going to be the outside. And you turn it so the inside shows. And here we fold the long edges towards the middle. So kind of fold it to about halfway, the other side up to meet it overlapping. And the idea is that it's an even fold so that each end is the same. And ideally the end will measure approximately 8.5 centimetres. It's just a guideline really. The main thing is that on this side of the mask that you've got a reasonable overlap, about 1.5 centimetres, 2 centimetres approximately, around the long edges of the mouthpiece. And the mouthpiece is nice and straight in the middle. And then we're going to press on this side, just helps to give a neater finish. And the next stage is to then top stitch right along each of the long edges of the mask. And that's what I'm going to do now. So, as before, I'm using orange cotton for the sake of showing what I'm doing. Obviously I would use black in this case normally. But I find it quite helpful to place the needle a little way along the edge with the intention of actually back stitching, because the edges can be quite thick. So I'm going to actually back sew from here. I'm using my guide again to about 0.5 centimetre from the edge of the material. I'm just running it backwards first and then forwards, and then towards the end I'm going to back stitch it to secure the stitching. There we are, so you end up with a line of stitching right along the top, and I'm going to repeat that on the other edge now. Alright, so this is the last stage of making the mask, and it's quite important to do this correctly to get the right shape at the end. So you've got your mask, this is the inside obviously, with the folds towards the middle. You're going to take the right hand fold it back towards the middle, but then bend the corner back on itself towards the top stitching, towards the edge that you've just created. But this line here, this edge, has to be parallel with this top edge here, which can mean you sort of position it further up than you might think is necessary, but it produces the best results at the end of the day. So here it would sit like that. The other important thing is that this is going to be sewn to itself only, so through here, not to the rest of the mask. And then I pin it kind of at the top here to hold it in place through those 2 layers of the fold rather than onto the mask. So if I turn it back, you'll see it's not going to catch there. And I'm going to sew it in this direction, so from here along the edge to here. So effectively I'm going to open up the mask, slide it under the foot, start the needle quite close to the top stitching, put the needle in and remove the pin. And then I'm going to do a couple of stitches, back stitch, and just run along the edge of the fold there, back stitch, and that's it. That's lined up parallel with the top, and the stitching goes nice and close to the top stitching, but it's also not caught this part of the mask. So that's what we're aiming for with all the corners. So for this one, again, folded towards the middle and back on itself. Already it's getting slightly trickier to do because of the shape of the mask, but that's what you're aiming for. So I'm going to bend it back on itself to achieve that. And again, I find it easier to sew from the centre of the mask in that direction. So I'm going to pin it in the corner there to hold it while I position the mask under the foot. You can see it needs to all just be arranged nice and flat. And again, I'm going to position my needle this side of the top stitching, move the pin just so back towards the edge here. And now again, you can see there that the stitching runs up to the seam but not over it. And I'm going to repeat that same sewing at the other end, and that will give the shape that we need. And you can see the two are parallel with the top of the mask. So I'm just going to sew the last corner. The mask has a particular shape now, so just position it carefully. And again, I'm just going to sew from the centre to the outside, the needle in there. So I've now sewn all 4 corners, so all loose at the centre, to give you your shape. We've had some good feedback on this mask from people that have been using it. I hope that you find the same and that you find these instructions helpful.